You've been through chemo, Henry. You're not as sharp as you used to be. We need someone fresher. She didn't even look me in the eye when she said it, her gaze fixed on her laptop screen like I was a system error to be deleted, an inconvenience that didn't deserve a second thought. My name is Henry Cole, and I'm 61 years old. I spent over 2 decades as the operations director at Branston Dynamics, an industrial equipment firm based in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where calloused hands and quiet consistency kept the machines running and the promises kept. Even during my battle with cancer through months of chemotherapy, fatigue, and pain, I never missed a shift, never left a team shorthanded, but none of that mattered now. I didn't lash out. I didn't plead or curse or even flinch. I just closed my worn leather folder, nodded once, and walked out of the room, leaving behind a younger generation that saw legacy as a liability. What they didn't know, what none of them even bothered to check, was that I'd been holding a card. One written into my contract years ago by a man who built Branston from scratch. A man who once told me, if they ever forget who helped build this place, make sure your worth doesn't get buried with it. That day had come. My name is Henry Cole, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of man no one really noticed unless something went wrong. The man behind the scenes who made sure everything worked as it should, who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for more than a fair shake and the chance to build something that mattered. I spent 23 years at Branston Dynamics, a company once known for its integrity and precision, where steel met discipline and where respect was earned through sweat, not titles. I wasn't the visionary or the loud voice in the boardroom with grand ideas and buzzwords. I was the steady hand on the control panel, the one who made sure shipments left on time, that systems stayed running, and that the people on the floor had what they needed to do their jobs. I trained dozens of younger workers over the years, some of them fresh out of high school, others desperate for a second chance after life had kicked them around, and I never once thought of myself as indispensable, just dependable. And maybe that's what made it hurt more, because even after my cancer diagnosis, even after weeks of chemo that left my body brittle and my nerves frayed, I still showed up. I remember sitting in my truck outside the plant some mornings, hands shaking from the nausea, waiting for the meds to settle before I could walk in with my head held high. I told myself it mattered that loyalty meant something, that perseverance would be recognized. But when the company founder passed away and his only son, David, stepped back from day-to-day operations, it didn't take long for the tone to change. They brought in Kristen Mallory, a 32-year-old executive with a Harvard MBA, zero manufacturing experience, and a ruthless sense of efficiency that treated every veteran employee as a line item to be optimized or eliminated. She talked about streamlining and modernizing, throwing around words like synergy and scalability as if we built apps instead of hydraulic presses. Still, I held my tongue. I had seen trends come and go, seen consultants show up with bold plans, only to disappear when things got tough. I believed the core would hold until it didn't. Behind her polished language and tight smiles, Kristen had one goal: clean house. And she started with the people who remembered what the company used to stand for, people like me, like Tony in engineering or Gail in quality control. One by one, we were let go, sometimes under the guise of restructuring, sometimes without any explanation at all. But in my case, it was personal. She saw my age, saw the scar under my shirt from my port, and decided I was too slow, too damaged, too expensive to keep around. What she didn't know, and what no one had bothered to check, was that my contract had been written differently. Not just a standard template pulled from HR, but personally crafted by Leon Branston, the founder himself, a man who'd started the company in a 2-car garage and built it with bare hands and sheer will. He'd included a clause, buried deep in the legal jargon, that guaranteed 2 years severance if I was terminated without documented cause, a clause he'd insisted on back when he promoted me to director of operations and told me, this company runs because of people like you, not despite you. Leon was the kind of boss who showed up to your kid's graduation if you invited him, who kept a bottle of aspirin in his desk drawer because he knew how many of us worked through migraines just to keep the lines moving. He gave me the flexibility to take my wife Karen to every radiation treatment, never docking my pay, never asking questions, just quietly rescheduling meetings or stepping into my shoes himself. When she passed away 6 years ago, it was Leon who sat quietly in the back of the funeral hall, hat in hand, eyes glassy. He didn't say much, but his presence said everything. Kristen, on the other hand, never once spoke to me like a person. To her, I was legacy clutter, a stubborn relic of the old ways that needed to be swept aside for quarterly growth. The moment she said, "We need someone fresher," I realized I wasn't just being fired, I was being erased. But the contract, that small piece of legal foresight, was my shield. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about principle, about respect, about making sure that the generation who built the foundation wasn't discarded without a fight. So I picked up the phone and called Mark Ellison, a longtime friend and one of the best labor attorneys in the state. He had been waiting, almost eager for the chance to push back against the growing trend of age-based terminations hidden behind buzzwords and boardroom smiles. "They messed with the wrong man," he said after reading the contract, his voice steady, measured. "This one's airtight. But even then, I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I wanted recognition, maybe even an apology, the kind of simple decency that used to mean something. Instead, what I got was silence. And sometimes, silence is all the permission you need to take things into your own hands. Branson Dynamics wasn't just where I worked, it was where I belonged. And that feeling of belonging didn't come from a paycheck or a title, but from the way the company was built, brick by brick, by a man who believed that hard work and integrity mattered more than degrees or polish. His name was Leon Branston, and while the world might remember him as a pioneering industrialist in the Midwest, I remember him as a man who once stood in the pouring rain beside me while we figured out why Line 3 wouldn't restart, soaked to the bone, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, and not a word of complaint. Leon started the company in 1979 with nothing more than a rusted lathe in the back of his father's garage in Dayton, Ohio, and a belief that if you made machines that never quit, people would never forget. And they didn't. Over 4 decades, he turned that single lathe into a 50 million manufacturing operation, supplying critical equipment to auto plants, power stations, and freight hubs across the Rust Belt. He didn't just build a company, he built a legacy, and more importantly, a family. I joined Branston in the late 90s after the machine shop I'd worked for shut down following a merger. I was 36, with 2 kids, a mortgage, and a resume that couldn't hide the fact that I never finished college. What I had was experience, calluses, and a stubborn refusal to give up, and somehow Leon saw that as enough. He interviewed me himself, and I still remember how he leaned back in his chair and said, "I don't need a diploma to tell me if a man knows how to fix a gearbox. Show me you can keep things running, and I'll take care of the rest." And he did. Within 2 years, I was leading operations, not because I asked for it, but because I earned it. Leon never forgot the birthdays of floor staff, never missed a Thanksgiving potluck, and never allowed management to treat anyone like they were disposable. He believed in people, not just their skills, but their stories. He knew who was caring for a sick parent, who was struggling to send a kid to college, who was 3 months sober and trying to stay that way. That's the kind of boss he was. When my wife Karen was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, Leon didn't wait for me to ask for time off. He came into my office, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Your job right now is to take care of her. Everything else can wait." And for nearly 2 years, he rearranged shifts, reassigned duties, and filled in gaps so I could be with her through surgeries, treatments, and finally, her last days. Not once did he make me feel like a burden. When she passed, it was Leon who sat beside me at the gravesite, silent but present, his eyes damp, his presence unshakable. But time has a cruel way of replacing people like Leon with ones like Kristen Mallory, and after a mild stroke and mounting pressure from shareholders, Leon stepped down quietly. He sold off the majority of his shares to a private board and left the company in the hands of his only son, David, who in turn brought in Kristen to modernize the operation. It didn't take long before the warmth drained from the hallways and the place began to feel more like a spreadsheet than a workplace. Leon and I still spoke occasionally, short calls, mostly, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice even when he tried to hide it. He'd ask how the shop was running, if Gail was still keeping the quality lab spotless, if Marcus finally got that supervisor promotion. He'd chuckle at old stories, but never said much about what the new leadership was doing. I think he wanted to believe things would work out, that Kristen just needed time to understand the heart of the company. But I could tell he was afraid to look too closely, because what he'd find might break him. The last time we met in person, just a few weeks before I was let go, he invited me to lunch at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. He looked thinner, more fragile than I remembered, but his eyes were still sharp. He pushed a folder across the table, an old, weathered copy of my original employment contract. He tapped a section near the bottom and said, "I had them include this for a reason. You gave me decades, Henry. If they ever forget that, don't let them walk over you." I didn't understand then why he seemed so resigned. But now, as I stood in the same spot where he once welcomed me aboard, watching younger staff avert their eyes as I packed up my things, I realized Leon had seen this coming. Not the specifics, maybe, but the betrayal, the erosion of values, the slow turning of something once noble into something cold and transactional. And in that realization, something hardened inside me. I wasn't going to go quietly. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day that started like any other, a stale coffee in hand, inbox full of minor emergencies, and the quiet hum of machines warming up across the floor. I just finished walking the line, checking on a retrofit project in Assembly B, when I got the message. "Ms. Mallory would like to see you in her office. ASAP. No punctuation, no context. Just a cold command from her assistant, the same young man who still called me Mr. Cole out of habit, even though I could see the discomfort in his eyes every time our paths crossed. I knew. The second I stepped into that sterile glass office, with its polished chrome accents and framed motivational quotes about innovation and disruption, I knew what was coming. Kristen didn't ask me to sit. She didn't offer coffee or even a nod of acknowledgement. She just launched straight in, flipping through a thin file with exaggerated efficiency, like this was just another task she needed to cross off before lunch. She said the company was shifting direction, that operations were being streamlined, that they were realigning the organizational structure to meet evolving market demands. I didn't interrupt. I'd heard this language before, not just in business school, textbooks, or HR templates, but in the pain stories of other friends who'd been let go after decades of service. These weren't explanations. They were just noise. But then she said it, the sentence that would echo in my head for weeks. "You've been an important part of our past, Henry, but unfortunately, you're no longer aligned with our future." She might as well have told me I was obsolete, like one of the aging machines we decommissioned last quarter, carted out the back dock and sold for scrap. I didn't argue, because I understood the game. This wasn't a conversation. It was a decision already made, likely days ago, maybe even weeks, and now I was just being handed the script. I asked one question because I felt it deserved to be asked. "Is there a documented issue with my performance?" She blinked, momentarily thrown off, then shuffled some papers as if the answer was hidden between spreadsheets. "There have been concerns raised about resistance to new processes," she said, carefully avoiding specifics. "You've shown hesitation in adopting several changes the leadership team has proposed. That can create friction." Friction. That's what decades of experience and loyalty had become. Friction. I nodded slowly, not because I accepted it, but because I needed the conversation to end before I said something I'd regret. There were no written warnings, no performance reviews, no formal complaints, just vague language and the unmistakable stench of ageism wrapped in corporate speak. So I stood, thanked her for the opportunity, a phrase I had to force through my teeth, and walked out. Not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of surreal calm, like watching a slow-motion car crash you can't stop but saw coming a mile away. Back in my workstation, I gathered my things, a couple of framed photos, a coffee mug from my first year on the job, and a small binder of notes I'd handwritten over the years, detailing procedures, vendor contacts, and maintenance hacks that kept the place running through blackouts and budget cuts. As I packed, younger employees avoided my gaze. Some looked ashamed, others just confused. A few, I think, wanted to say something, maybe even offer a quiet word of thanks, but none did. I didn't blame them. Fear makes cowards out of even the best people. By the time I reached my truck, the last box tucked onto the passenger seat, the weight of it all, not just the firing, but the quiet dismissal of my worth, began to settle in my chest. But beneath that weight was something else, something steady and steel hard. Resolve. Because what Kristen didn't know, and what no one in that bright, soulless conference room had cared enough to check, was that buried in my original contract, in language so dry it would put most attorneys to sleep, was a clause inserted by Leon Branston himself, a clause that guaranteed 2 full years of severance pay in the event of termination without documented cause, as explicitly defined in a separate appendix. And cause, by law and by that contract, required much more than vague claims about resistance to change. It required documentation, written warnings, performance improvement plans, incident reports, none of which existed. Leon had insisted on that clause back when I'd turned down an offer from a competitor, telling him I wasn't going anywhere unless the company gave me a reason to. He smiled that day and said, "If they ever do, I want it to cost them." So while Kristen patted herself on the back for cleaning house, while the board nodded along with her vision of a younger, sleeker, faster workforce, I made a quiet call to Mark Ellison, my attorney. He'd been waiting for this moment, contract already reviewed, and case file half prepared. "They just gave us everything we need," he said, his voice calm but electric with certainty. "This wasn't just a layoff, it was a reckoning." The morning after I was let go, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where Karen and I had once planned our children's birthdays, discussed doctor's visits, and dreamed about a simple retirement we never got to share. Now it was covered in legal documents, highlighters, and a steaming mug of coffee I couldn't quite bring myself to drink. The silence in the house was heavy but familiar, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't rushing to be anywhere. Still, my mind was turning like a gear that refused to grind to a halt. I was reviewing the contract with Mark Ellison when my phone rang. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months, Leon Branston. At first, I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to hear what I already suspected that he hadn't known, or worse, that he had and chose to say nothing. But old habits are hard to break, and respect, real, earned respect, doesn't vanish overnight. "Henry," he said, his voice strained, each word heavy with something between confusion and guilt. "What happened yesterday?" I didn't dodge the question. I didn't dramatize it either. I told him simply, "You should probably ask Kristen." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that tells you everything before words even try. "She said you were undermining her authority," he finally muttered, as though he didn't believe it himself. "That you were resistant to the new direction." I didn't reply right away. I let the silence fill the space again because sometimes silence is more revealing than argument, and Leon, to his credit, understood exactly what I wasn't saying. "You're going to file, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "I already have," I replied. "Mark's handling it." He sighed, the kind of sigh that sounds like it's been building for years. "I warned her," he said, almost to himself. "Told her to read the contracts. Told her not to touch the senior team without understanding who they really were." Then, after another pause, "She let go of Tony, and Gail too." My jaw tightened. Tony had been the head of engineering for over a decade, the kind of man who could reverse engineer a turbine blindfolded. Gail practically ran the quality control division like it was her own child, ruthless in the best way, with zero tolerance for shortcuts or sloppiness. And now, just like me, they were gone. I didn't ask Leon whether this was the future he'd envisioned. I didn't need to. His silence told me he knew exactly what had been lost, and that perhaps, in giving away control, he'd also watched his legacy start to erode under someone else's ambition. After the call ended, I stood by the window for a long time, staring at the backyard that had once echoed with laughter, swings creaking, and summer dinners under the maple tree Karen and I planted our first year in the house. That tree had survived 2 lightning strikes and a disease that nearly killed it. I'd braced its trunk, trimmed it back, fed it, nursed it, and in doing so, I understood something I hadn't realized before. Survival wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about how you came back from them. So I made my next call not to lawyers or press, but to Tony, then Gail, and then one by one, to every senior employee I knew Kristen had pushed out. Some were still reeling, others furious, all of them afraid that years of service had ended in a matter of minutes, afraid that their age, their experience, their slower but wiser pace no longer had value. I told them all the same thing. Breathe. Check your contracts. Talk to Mark. You're not alone in this. And they weren't. That afternoon, I called Douglas Keene, owner of Ironwood Precision, a small but fiercely innovative firm on the other side of Springfield. who'd been trying to recruit me for years. Douglas was an old-school operator in a modern world, believed in sweat equity, paid his welders better than most engineers in town, and had an instinct for talent that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "You still interested?" I asked. He didn't even hesitate. "Thought you'd never call." That one phone call changed everything. 3 days later, I was sitting across a long table from Kristen and Branston Dynamics in-house counsel. Mark sat beside me, calm and precise as ever, with a copy of my contract open to the highlighted clause. Kristen looked impatient, almost bored, as if this were a minor inconvenience she could bulldoze through. The attorney, a young guy in a tailored suit who looked like he'd spent more time in seminars than courtrooms, flipped through the document with a growing sense of unease. "This clause is quite clear," Mark said, tapping the page. "Termination without documented cause results in 2 years of severance. That's roughly $320,000, plus fees." Kristen crossed her arms, her voice clipped. "He refused to adapt. That's insubordination." Mark didn't flinch. "Where's the documentation? Written warnings? Performance reviews? Any record of misconduct?" The attorney flipped through a thin folder, finding nothing but empty buzzwords and vague summaries. There was no case. And worse, there was a pattern, one that Mark had already begun piecing together. A quiet purge of staff over 50, with no process, no paper trail, and no plan beyond replacement for the sake of youth. "I'll offer 6 months," Kristen snapped, still clinging to control. 2 years, Mark replied evenly, "or we go to court, and I'll make sure discovery includes every termination you authorized, including Tony, Gail, and 4 others over 50. That was when the door opened and Leon walked in. 6 months had passed since I last stood inside Branson Dynamics, and though the building hadn't changed, the glass walls still gleamed, the lobby still smelled faintly of varnish and fresh paper. The atmosphere was different. Hollow, like something essential had drained from the bones of the place. The quarterly board meeting had just been called to order when I stepped into the back of the room. Unnoticed at first, a quiet observer in a space I once helped hold together, with little more than routine and resolve. Kristen Mallory sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by her new executive team, younger, glossier, all of them tapping nervously on tablets, eyes flicking toward each other but never meeting mine. I wasn't scheduled to speak until the end. That had been the arrangement. Let her present first. Let her explain the 37% drop in revenue, the lost manufacturing contracts, the delays, the resignations, the spiraling morale, all without interruption. She started with poise, masking uncertainty behind confident phrases and over-rehearsed slides. She blamed shifting market conditions, supply chain disruptions, and legacy inefficiencies, a term she used like it was dust she'd been trying to sweep from the corners of the company. But by the 4th chart, cracks began to show. She stumbled on a number. Her voice tightened. One board member leaned forward, visibly unconvinced. Another scribbled something down and shook his head. And then she saw me. Her words faltered mid-sentence as her eyes locked onto mine across the room. "What is he doing here?" she demanded, her composure cracking like a cheap veneer. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and unfiltered. "He's not supposed to be—" "Kristen," said Leon Branston, seated calmly near the end of the table, his voice barely above a whisper but firm enough to halt her cold. "Sit down." She blinked, unsure if she'd misheard, but the board chairman was already standing, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat with deliberate control. "The board has reached a decision regarding company leadership," he announced. "And since it directly involves Mr. Cole, we've invited him to address the room." She froze, her jaw clenched. "You can't be serious." Leon stood slowly. Age had bent his posture and dulled the fire in his gait, but his presence still commanded the room the way it always had. "You hold 20% of the company's shares, Kristen," he said, his voice steady but tired. "I retained 51. That number hit like a thunderclap. She turned toward him, disbelief painted across her face, lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. I stepped forward then, not out of triumph, but necessity. I placed the folder on the table, the same one Mark had used during our severance negotiation, though what it now held was far more transformative. I opened it and began to speak, not with revenge in my voice, but with the deliberate clarity of someone who'd waited a long time for the truth to be heard. "Over the past 6 months," I said, "I've been working with Ironwood Precision. under the leadership of Douglas Keene, a partnership formed after my departure from this company. We started with 3 employees. As of today, we've hired 12, 7 of whom were let go from Branston Dynamics, including your former engineering lead, QA head, and systems architect. Our facility is fully operational. Our contracts include 3 of your former clients, and our profit margins are up because we chose to honor the experience that built this industry rather than discard it. Kristen laughed short, bitter, hollow. This is absurd. You're starting a smear campaign because you couldn't handle being replaced. No, Leon said, stepping beside me, his cane tapping softly against the floor. This is business, and you failed to treat it that way. She turned to him, eyes wide. You're siding with him? I'm siding with the company I built, he replied. Not harshly, but with the finality of a man who'd watched too much rot spread too far. And I'm taking it back. Kristen reached for the stack of documents I'd placed before her, flipping pages furiously as she tried to find a loophole, a clause, anything to hold on to. But the merger had already been approved. Branston Dynamics would be absorbed into Ironwood, retaining the name for the sake of legacy, but undergoing full leadership, restructuring effective immediately. The board had already signed. The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked around the table, saw eyes lowered, saw others watching me with the kind of acknowledgement I hadn't felt in years. Kristen, however, wasn't finished. You think this is over? She hissed. You'll never work with any of our remaining vendors. I'll blacklist you from every contract we. But she stopped mid-threat when Leon spoke again. Enough. The board voted. The transition begins today. She stared at him, stunned, her voice gone. And for the first time since the day she dismissed me, I felt nothing, not anger, not joy, just a kind of quiet closure that felt more satisfying than any outburst ever could. As I turned to leave, I passed Kristen in the hallway, now seated alone outside the boardroom with the final documents in her lap. She didn't look up, and I didn't speak. Some endings don't need words, and some battles are won not with noise, but with patience, truth, and the resolve to hold your ground even when it's no longer welcome. 1 year after I was fired from Branston Dynamics, I stood on the mezzanine of our new facility, a converted aerospace hangar on the east side of Springfield, watching the controlled chaos of a production floor come alive with the rhythm of work done right. Machines hummed in unison, voices called out with calm urgency, and the scent of cutting oil and warm steel drifted up through the open rafters. It was the kind of sound I hadn't realized I'd missed until I heard it again, the sound of purpose in motion. We named the company Ironwood Legacy, not because we were trying to erase what came before, but because we believed in honoring it. Ironwood, after the strongest tree in North America, which bends in storms but rarely breaks. Legacy, because what we were building wasn't just for now, but for every worker who'd ever been told they were too old, too expensive, too sick, or simply too much trouble to keep around. And this time, we were doing it on our terms. Douglas Keene handled the investment and growth strategy. He was nearing retirement himself, a man who knew exactly what kind of future he wanted to leave behind. Tony now headed engineering, rebuilding the department from scratch, one blueprint at a time. Gail ran our new QA lab with the same discipline she'd always carried, except now she had a team that respected her, not feared being replaced by someone younger and cheaper. Jason, one of the best CNC programmers I'd ever worked with, had just completed training 2 apprentices who reminded me more of myself than I cared to admit, quiet, hungry, and full of good instincts no school could teach. Even Jennifer, still at Branston during the transition, had quietly fed us information and insights until her retirement came through. She joined us soon after, not out of spite, but because she said, I want to end my career in a place that still believes in people. As for me, I didn't chase revenge. Not really. What I wanted, what I needed, was to prove that value isn't defined by youth or by trend charts, but by character, experience, and consistency. It's a truth that's easy to forget in an age of disruption and reinvention, but it's still the truth nonetheless. And when the board merged Branston Dynamics into our operation, effectively placing its name and legacy under our stewardship, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible. Leon came by every few weeks, walking the floor slowly with a cane in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Eyes sharp, asking questions not because he doubted us, but because he still cared. His health hadn't improved much, but his spirit had. He told me once that watching us rebuild gave him a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. "You gave it back its soul," he said one afternoon, watching a new batch of hydraulic cores pass quality check. "Not just the company, the people too." A few months ago, Kristen called Leon from Miami, where she'd relocated to start a consultancy firm. She asked if he'd consider investing. He told her he would, but only if she came back, walked the floor, met the team, learned the business the way he had. She hung up, but she called back the next morning, asking if the offer still stood. I don't know what path she'll take. That's her story to write. Mine is here. As I looked out over the shop floor that day, seeing Gail at her station, Tony deep in design notes, and Jason explaining code to a kid not much older than my grandson, I realized that this, not money, not power. This was the victory. Not in crushing the ones who cast us aside, but in proving that we were never broken to begin with. We were just waiting for the right ground to grow again. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with a spotlight. Sometimes, it arrives quietly in a steady paycheck for someone who thought their last chance was already gone. In the nod of respect from a younger colleague who finally sees what experience really means, in the simple truth that you can be cut down but still rise again. If you've ever felt discarded, forgotten, or told you were past your prime, this story is for you. And if it moved something in you, if it reminded you of your worth, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it today. AZO. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength, late justice, and the power of standing tall when the world pushes you down.